Hello, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to be going over some of the scariest ghost stories from around the web. If you enjoy this video, please be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. If you don't like this video, leave a dislike, and let me know why in the comments. Now, let's get into the fearful findings. A man and a little girl showed up at my front door last night. Last night, at around 10 p.m., my boyfriend and I were sitting in the living room, trying to find a movie to watch on Amazon Prime Video. We have video surveillance cameras everywhere outside. There are two that point to the front door at different angles, one for the backyard and one for the side of the house. The monitor screen is kept in the living room on a table next to the recliner that I was sitting on. I just sat down for not even 5 minutes. Then I heard a child's voice come over the monitor. The voice said, "Hello." I thought to myself for a minute, fuck, does my son have his bedroom window open and is yelling through the window for some reason, and the camera is picking it up because there is a camera next to his bedroom window? Then I remembered, no, it can't be, because he was sleeping in my bed. I called up to him, and he answered. I look at the monitor screen, and I see a man who appears to be very tall. He was wearing a red and white flannel shirt. He was holding a little girl's hand. She looked like she had striped long sleeves with frizzy blonde hair. They were walking up the steps to get into our entryway, and I turned to my boyfriend and said, "Somebody is here." We live in the middle of absolute nowhere. We live in a swamp. My closest neighbors are bears and coyotes, and a couple Amish houses are about a mile or so down the road. So there are never, at least, any people that we know of who go walking down our street pitch black with no street lights on a back road at 10 p.m. at night. So it seemed very strange to us. Just as the man and the girl get to our front door, my boyfriend opens the door, and they are gone. There was not a single trace or sign of them. My boyfriend goes outside by the road to see if he can see any cars, but there is nothing. We thought maybe they were having car trouble and stopped for help, but there were no signs of that being a possibility. I let the dog outside, and my boyfriend went outside with a flashlight, but nothing was there. We watched the camera footage, and the people coming to the door were never recorded. We reviewed old camera footage and saw nothing that looked or sounded like that. We don't even know people that look like that or ever have anybody that could have possibly come over that looked like that. My boyfriend does not believe in ghosts, but seeing that we had no explanation for it, I think he changed his mind. We have lived in this house for 4 years, and I personally have never experienced anything until last night. My boyfriend admitted that the one night I was at work, he saw something moving in the yard and thought it was an animal, but he went out to look and nothing was there. But my son's tire swing was swinging back and forth like crazy. My son has been complaining for the past few months that he doesn't like to sleep in his bed because it sounds like something is crawling around under his bed and his bed shakes. The original part of the house was built in the 1800s and was used as an old school house. An addition was put on the house 20 years ago to make it bigger. The old school master used to live across the street in a house that is no longer there. I talked to my boyfriend today, and we both said that what happened is really weird, and we've come to terms with it probably being a ghost sighting. I know I'm not crazy because he saw them and heard the voice too. I've seen many ghosts in my lifetime. I just wondered why it took me so long to see one here. What bothers me is that it seemed like they wanted to get my attention, and it makes me feel very uneasy. A few days leading up to this, I would sit in the living room and just feel overwhelming dread and terrible anxiety. After seeing them, I don't feel any of that anymore. So, weird. Edit. My son hasn't been sleeping in his room because I'm not forcing him to. When he tells me these things, I let him know that I believe him 100%. We are turning what used to be his playroom into a new bedroom. I wanted to see what he was experiencing in his current bedroom, so I went in there myself and took my naps before work in his room. I work night shift, and every single night I would have a nightmare. So I said he can sleep in my room until his new room is ready, which will hopefully be ready in a couple days. A terrifying encounter while in Iraq. I was a sergeant in the U.S. Army and ETSing getting out from the military when President Bush ordered more troops into Iraq in 2003. I had just returned home to Austin, Texas, when I was summoned into my local National Guard unit at Camp Mabry and told that I was being recalled to the Army, but the unit was already tasked out to deploy to Iraq. I was not part of their unit yet, so the commander offered to give me a waiver to deploy with a government contractor, Halliburton, in Houston. I knew that I would make more money as a contractor, so I took the offer. Not long after arriving in Kuwait at Camp Doha, I began working with the operations team, overseeing logistics affairs. We would oversee the daily convoy of supply between Kuwait and Baghdad, a route riddled with ID incidents, small arms skirmishes, and almost constant breakdowns of army and civilian vehicles. Because I was a SAW gunner in the 1st Infantry Division while on active duty and was technically still in the Guard, I was often in the convoys, manning a mounted weapon that accompanied the mostly civilian convoys. During these runs, we had a few strange encounters in an area south of Baghdad known then as Camp Babylon. Occupied by French troops but then designated an archaeological site for obvious reasons, Camp Babylon was set up in the area that was said to originally be inhabited by the famous Tower of Babel. Indeed, there were ruins there that did look like a massive structure once stood at that spot. I had 2 strange incidents happen to me while passing through there. The first incident seems a bit benign, but it sets the mood for the second. We were passing through Camp Babylon in the afternoon one day when our convoy took small arms fire. The SOP at the time, standard operating procedure, was to stop the convoy and return fire. This was because, in the past, such incidents ended up being a long gunman attempting to scare the convoy into running into IEDs on the road. Because of this, the SOP changed to stop the convoy, dismount, and return fire. While engineers looked for explosive devices on the road, we scanned the horizon for enemies. Nothing. They most likely fled immediately. However, the ruins around Camp Babylon were alive with shadow figures that seemed to move about the area. Several times, we would spot the figures, but they would immediately disappear. A contractor, lying beside me with his weapon, commented, "How odd that we are in the shadow of Babel and fighting the supernatural." I didn't respond, but I knew he was a 32nd degree Mason who was really into the arcane aspects of Babylon, etc. I didn't feel, at the time, that much was supernatural, but certainly I did see the shadowy and bizarrely small figures dart about the structures. Once the road was deemed clear, we continued on to Baghdad. The second incident occurred about a month later. At this point, the weather in southern Iraq and Kuwait had turned quite cold at night. During this encounter, we had just completed the supply run to Baghdad and were returning back to Camp Doha in Kuwait when a vehicle in our convoy broke down. Once again, we found ourselves right at Camp Babylon. While the army mechanics took a look at the vehicle and the rest of us took up fighting positions around the area, strange things began to occur. It started with a strange light bobbing in the desert. Thinking it was a person with a flashlight, we used NVG's night vision goggles to watch. It was simply a glowing ball of light moving towards a set of ruins. After initial contact with the light, a few of us had moved forward away from the convoy to see what the source was. After seeing it was self-contained and not a person, we were a bit alarmed. Then we heard a sound that I will never forget. A long wailing began from one of the ruined structures or foundations not far away. It sounded like a woman in agony, mixed with loneliness. On and on the sounds went while we huddled in the cold and dark, wondering what the hell we were listening to. With our NVGs equipped, we used our flashlights to spotlight the ruins. If you've ever done this, you will know that a normal flashlight with NVGs looks like a massive beam of light. We scoured the area, but no source of the wails or the ball of light were seen. About this time, we were told via radio that the vehicle was repaired and ready to roll, so we decided to return to the convoy. I was slinging my saw over my shoulder when I noticed my contractor partner was staring at the ruins in horror. He was frozen. I shook him, and he snapped out of his stupor, quickly leaving the area with the rest of us. Once we were back at the camp, and it was pleasantly daylight the following morning, several of us were chatting about the encounter at Camp Babylon before our daily operations briefing. It was then that I remembered the terrified expression on the face of the contractor. So I asked him about it. He was still obviously traumatized by the event, but managed to explain that, as we were leaving our position on the sandy hill, he saw a tall, black figure standing beside the ruins. It was watching us as we were looking for him, her, or it. He said that he felt an instant wave of despair hit him and thought that he was going to die. He didn't remember leaving the area. His next memory was in the Humvee, headed back to Kuwait. I now write non-fiction books about haunted places for Llewellyn Publishing and have visited hundreds of reputedly haunted spots. But I'll never forget the wailing figure at the ruins of Babel. It's also worth noting that when I related this story to some of our Pakistani employees at Camp Doha and Camp Arifjan, they were also quite horrified. One of them, a translator we called Artie, said that we had encountered a jinn, or a damned spirit, and that we were lucky to be able to tell the tale. I agree. Don't talk about the skinwalkers. I have a story. It isn't mine, but it happened to my uncle. He used to tell this story when we went camping, and it scared the lights out of me every time I heard it. We live in Utah, and my uncle, Mark, went on a mission at 19. They sent him to an Indian reservation in Arizona. They paired him up with a companion named Carl. When they first got there, there was a huge rift with the locals on the reservation about their being there. They didn't want my uncle and Carl to stay on the reservation grounds. Eventually, they came to the compromise that they would stay on the outskirts in a trailer. This reservation wasn't very big and was located next to a heavily wooded area. The first night, they were trying to sleep when, all of a sudden, their trailer started to shake violently back and forth. Startled and not sure what was happening, they climbed under their table for cover. Mark could distinctively hear someone pushing it from both sides of the trailer, like a group of people. After about 5 minutes, it stopped. The next day, they made rounds on the reservation and were talking to the locals. Carl made a comment to one of the families that their trailer was shaking the night before. The family got very quiet and then told them they had to leave. They thought it was strange, but didn't think much of it. The next night, it happened again. They awoke to their trailer shaking back and forth. Again, they climbed under the table until it stopped. This went on for 2 more nights. Anytime they tried to talk to anyone about it, they got quiet and told them to leave. Mark started thinking that, due to the tension of their arrival, the locals were doing this to scare them off the reservation. They then went into a convenience store, and they were talking together about how frustrated they were with the situation. The clerk overheard and said, "They can't talk about it. It's forbidden." Confused, they ask him, "Can't we talk about what?" The guy continues to tell them about the skinwalkers. He says they are evil demons that were once Native American witches. If they talk about it, the skinwalkers will come for their souls. They just walked out of there, baffled. They thought it was another scare tactic. So that night, when the shaking started again, my uncle decided to be brave and confront them. He went to the trailer door, flew it open, and yelled, "Hey!" When he did that, he saw these 3 animals run off. 2 were wolves, 1 was a bear. But they looked strange, almost with human features. As he watched them run towards the trees, all 3 stood up on 2 legs and walked slowly towards the trees, making a human cackling laugh. It scared him so bad that they called their mission president that next morning and asked to be moved. They were relocated that day. For a year, nothing happened. One day, they announced that Carl was being relocated to another city and Mark was getting a new companion, Jimmy. They had to drive for about an hour to pick Jimmy up from the airport. The road they traveled went through the boundaries of the reservation. They arrived at about 8 p.m. and met Jimmy, and then went to leave. The mission president tells Jimmy, "We are driving through a dangerous area at night, so we can't make any stops. If you need to use the restroom, you need to go now." Jimmy says, "I am fine." The mission president gets serious enough to even freak out Mark. "I am not kidding. Go to your business." Jimmy was insistent that he was fine, so they hit the road. As they were about 30 minutes into the drive, they were going through the area of the reservation boundaries, and Jimmy started complaining that he needed to pee badly. The mission president says, "We can't stop here. You'll have to hold it." Jimmy keeps going on, "I really can't hold it." So the mission president stops the car and says, "Okay, but you will do your business next to the door, and if I say get into the car, you better get into the car fast." With a look of confusion, Jimmy says, "All right," opens the door, and starts to do his business. About 5 seconds later, the mission president says nothing and just yanks Jimmy into the car and floors it. Jimmy and Mark start freaking out. What is going on? The mission president says nothing and just increases his speed. All of a sudden, Mark sees something next to the car to his right. A giant, wolf-looking man was running on 2 feet next to the car. Mark looked at the speedometer. They were going over 60 miles an hour and still increasing. The wolf creature kept right next to the car for 10 minutes until it finally took off into the trees. Shaking, Jimmy gets out of the car when they arrive. They didn't speak through the whole ordeal, and says, "What did I just see?" The mission president says, "Next time I tell you to take care of your business, you take care of your business." Haunted water park. I literally downloaded Reddit, so I can vent about this because I could get fired if I talk about it. I'm a lifeguard at a water park in Las Vegas. We always brag about how, unlike our competition, we have had 0 casualties at the current location. Stuff always happens, like tubes appearing in the pool after we just took them all out and stacked them, chairs moving around after we just sorted them, wet footsteps on concrete when no one was wet, etc. We joke that we don't get paid enough to fight demons. It was just a joke to us, but not to our supervisors or managers. They always made excuses. It was always the wind, I moved it, or they're my prints. They always got angry at us and said that someone could overhear us and complain. They even went as far as to threaten us with a defamation lawsuit if we talked about it on social media. Weird, right? If the park wasn't haunted, why would they care so much about us talking about it? I never cared because I believed my supervisors and managers. Maybe they did move the chairs, maybe they dipped their feet in the pool and walked away. That was until last month. It was 10 p.m., and we just finished cleaning the park. I had to stay later because I was getting a ride from my supervisor, Ryan. We were the few people left in the park, so we were doing a final walkthrough just to make sure everything was clean. We only had a flashlight and a few light posts illuminating our path around the park. We were walking by some slides when I heard someone, a woman, say, "Hello." I looked at Ryan, who didn't seem to hear it. Then we heard her again, "Hello?" I freaked, and Ryan, again, didn't seem to hear it. "Did you not hear that?" I said to Ryan. He shrugged and continued walking. I stopped and said I didn't want to do the walkthrough with him. He rolled his eyes and said if I didn't, I was refusing to work, which isn't a good thing to say to your supervisor. He told me I was probably just hearing things. I got a hold of myself and continued walking. We started getting to the back of the park, where the light posts were dimmer, and it was much quieter since we were further from the running water in the slides. Ryan and I started talking about school and college and what we were going to do when the season ends when I heard it again, but it sounded closer this time. "Hello? Anyone there?" She sounded very confused and tired. I jumped, and, again, Ryan did not care at all. I was so freaked out, I started feeling nauseous. I wanted to go home, but Ryan was my ride home, so I had to stay. What happened next haunts me. After we heard the voice, we heard what sounded like someone climbing out of the lazy river, soaking wet. No one else is here. If they were, they would be in the office. No one should be swimming. Ryan was angry. He thought a lifeguard had snuck into the river. He turned around and started yelling, "What the fuck? Go home. This isn't fun." He froze. I said a quick prayer and turned around. There was a lady, soaking wet, wearing a park shirt with her logo on it. But the logo looked very 2000s. I know what our shirts look like. I stand in the shop all the time to get some AC. I have never seen that shirt. She was hunched over, and her hair covered her face. She spoke, "Hello, can you help me?" Ryan grabbed my arm, and we bolted to the office. Lifeguards weren't allowed inside the office ever, it's a whole thing, but he let me come inside. He pulled one of the managers into the supply room and shut the door. Another supervisor started asking me if I was okay. I was breathing heavily and couldn't speak, but I nodded yes. Ryan and the manager came out of the room, and Ryan grabbed his stuff and said, "Let's go." We got in his car, and he said we needed to stop by the gas station first. When we pulled in, he told me to type my address into his phone while he pumped gas. When he got in the car, I broke the silence. What the fuck was that? What happened? He turned the car on and started driving. I can't tell anyone. It's like a park secret, but I'll tell you if you swear you won't tell anyone. I swore. Back in 2002, before this location of the park was built, there was a park on the Strip. It was the only water park in Vegas. We only had one casualty, and it was a lady who came in with her family. She got drunk and went into the lazy river, where she sank to the bottom of the river. Because there were so many tubes, the lifeguards didn't see her, and she drowned. That's why we have so many lifeguards for the river and why our tubes are see-through. So, was that her? Yeah. Why is she here? Ick, she's probably confused. She's always asking for help. So, you did hear her? Yeah, but everyone does when you're in the park late at night. It's a whole different story if you see her. What happens if you see her? Nothing, but it's scary. The car ride was silent the rest of the way. I still work at the park, but Ryan talked to the managers and convinced them to let me work only morning shifts. Ryan quit recently due to college. I only told 2 coworkers, but only because they have had experiences themselves. Thanks for letting me vent. Also, appreciate lifeguards and all the shit we go through. I found out years later that her son died in that room. When I was little, maybe around 7 or so, I had my first paranormal experience. My mom always told me that she felt like I attracted things from the spiritual realm even as a baby, but this experience is the first one that is in my own memory, and I remember it vividly, and I'm now 26 years old. My mom was unlucky enough to have not only my father died but also my little sister's father. My dad passed away due to a car accident, and my sister's dad committed suicide after a battle with severe depression. Needless to say, my mom had it pretty rough, and being a single working mother, she would often take us to a family friend who babysat us while she worked late nights at the hospital. The woman who babysat us was a warm, kind, and gentile woman named Rhonda. She always took the best care of us and my sister, and I really enjoyed staying with her. Rhonda had 2 birds who we loved to talk to, and they would repeat simple things like, "Hello," and "What's up?" We thought it was the coolest thing. After a long day of playing, my sister and I were off to bed, and Rhonda tucked me into my bed in her spare room downstairs. My sister was still pretty little, and she slept in the same room as Rhonda because she was too scared to sleep alone, and Rhonda was like a grandma to us, who was more than happy to share her bed if we got scared. I was a big girl and loved having my own room to sleep in, and I was never scared. On this night, though, I was having trouble falling asleep, and I just kept tossing and turning, growing frustrated that I wasn't asleep. For some reason, I began to get anxious and become fearful. I didn't know why I was scared, but I was. After what felt like forever of me laying there contemplating getting up and crawling into Rhonda's bed, I heard something in a low, calm male voice say, "Marissa, it's okay. Just go to sleep." This surprised me, but it didn't scare me. I believe that as a child, you're more open and susceptible to paranormal things due to the fact that you're not conditioned to be fearful yet. With age, you learn what's scary and all the things that go bump in the night that you should run away from, but I was still so innocent that I didn't register this as threatening. Actually, this calmed me down, and I started to feel very tired and just accepted what the voice told me and went to sleep. The next morning, Rhonda made us breakfast, as she always did. She sat across from me and sipped her coffee, which I always asked for a sip of because, if I wasn't already a strange child, I also had a taste for coffee. She asked me how I slept, and I told her that I was scared and that someone told me to go to sleep. She looked at me confused, and she asked me if I had a dream that someone was talking to me, and I told her no, I was awake. She said it was probably the birds talking, and again, I told her I was sure it wasn't. She then asked me if it was a man's voice or a woman's voice, and when I instantly said it was a man's voice, her face changed from the usual cheery, warm expression to one that was put off and uncomfortable. I had never seen her face look like that before, and I think that's why I remember this so vividly. She changed the subject quickly, and we went about our day, and I didn't think about that again for years. Fast forward into my teens. My mom and I were having a discussion about the paranormal because I had a lot of strange activity happening, and she asked me what the first experience I remember is. I shared the story about the man's voice at Rhonda's house and how odd Rhonda's reaction was, and my mom looked at me, and her eyes widened a bit. Rhonda went a little MIA a few years later, and unfortunately, she just slowly lost contact with us, and eventually she was no longer part of our lives. I hadn't seen her in years. When my mom collected her thoughts, she looked at me and said, "Marissa, you know Rhonda's son died in that room, right?" I did not. I knew she had a son who passed away from a tragic overdose, but I was so young and never met him, so I didn't think about it. I looked back at my mom, and we didn't have to say anything. We were both thinking the same thing. If I were hearing a spirit speak to me, there's a good chance it could have been her son. From what my mom said about him, he was a very kind and caring person, much like his mom. Maybe that's why I wasn't afraid when he spoke to me. I'm not saying that this is actually what happened, but it does make me wonder. The voice I heard was real, that much I do know. Regardless of who it belonged to, I'm sure that much is true. Since that experience, I've had many more, and unfortunately, they got much more sinister as I got older. It got very, very dark for a while, and I witnessed things that you usually only see in horror movies. I still think of this experience often, and I hope that you enjoyed reading my testimony. If you did enjoy this story, I also share my experiences as well as other strange and usual things on my YouTube channel. My handle is Marissa White. If you're more of a reader than a watcher, then not to worry, I'll be sharing more on here as well. Thank you for taking the time to read this, and remember, the spiritual realm is just as real as you or I. My life was saved by a ghost. My boyfriend of 5 years has crushed on me for probably 12 or 13 years. He was 2 grades below me and was a bad boy while I was popular and in all honors in college-level classes, so I wasn't aware he existed until I met him at my dad's business about 7 years ago. He He apparently talked about me being his dream girl and was teased that it would never happen, which is why I mentioned this. So in 2009, he and his best friend, I'll call him Josh, were getting into pills due to Josh's grandfather being an amputee and being unable to properly attend to or understand, hiding the medications, thus leaving large amounts of methadone, Klonopin, hydrocodone, and such lying around. This was before the opiate crisis that has affected my generation deeply in the last 15 years. 2 days before Christmas 2009, Josh overdosed in the bedroom that my boyfriend is currently staying in. It's a long story, but we moved back to our respective families because we were laid off during the pandemic and were in a bad wreck. Losing the extra car. The room has never felt spooky, never anything strange about it. But I've had a few pranks pulled on me that we believe Josh does to basically congratulate my boyfriend on being with the woman he waited for. I've woken up to sticky notes completely covering my body, my drinks poured on the floor, and random objects moved right where I exited the bed so that I stepped on them first thing in the morning. I swear I've heard giggling. Each time I've angrily asked my boyfriend if he was messing with me, and I'm aware when he's lying. He always says no. We like to think this is Josh playing practical jokes, something he was known for. But this is nothing compared to what Josh did for me in 2017. It wasn't a prank, it saved my life. For years ago, I went into anaphylactic shock. I lost all ability to speak or move my lower body. I was upstairs with a curved and steep staircase separating me from my phone. I remember crawling to the stairs, knowing it could be fatal if I smashed into the wall that the stairs led to before the turn with very large, steep steps. I know I was extremely oxygen deprived, but I immediately saw Josh and 2 of my deceased best friends ascend the stairs and carry me to the living room couch with my nebulizer and cell phone. I called 911, but I had no voice. My friends were gone, except Josh. He told me he was going to wake my boyfriend from the hammock in the back of my yard. And suddenly, my boyfriend dreamed of his friends saying that I was in trouble. My boyfriend came running into the house, and by this point, I was dying. I no longer could use any part of my body and no air came into my lungs when I inhaled. I remember thinking of my daughter and praying her father would navigate my loss to her and keep memories of me alive. He actually died in a freak accident 8 months ago, so now I'm fulfilling that for him. But I digress. I struggled to remain conscious, but I was fading. My boyfriend saw the 911 operator on the phone and my sweaty blue body. He told them he didn't think I was breathing, and by some absolute miracle, there was an ambulance passing my neighborhood. The hospital and dispatch were 30 minutes away. This coincidence, plus my boyfriend's sudden premonition that I was hurt, saved my life. Josh and those EMTs saved my life. I remember the EMT asking my boyfriend if I had overdosed. I hadn't, and I thought of how Josh had died. I was blabbering on about dead people saving me after a large amount of epinephrine, so no wonder they thought I was high. The doctors and EMT were baffled at how I managed to get down those stairs or even stay alive long enough to get help. I had one bruise on my leg that was tiny. That was it. And the worst headache I've ever had. It turns out I'm allergic to the latex and spray paint. I just told them I slid down the stairs, but it's not how I remember it. The weird thing is, I'd never met Josh when he was alive. I don't know how I recognized him or hallucinated him, but he looked exactly like the picture I was shown. I've had a lot of paranormal encounters, but my run-in with Josh saved my life, and he never even knew me. So, thanks, Josh, for giving me more time on this earth, and I wish we had met many years ago. I do hope he is resting peacefully, just periodically popping in to check on us. My trip to the slaughter yard. So let me start out by saying I enjoy writing. So this will be long, it is non-fiction though, but will hopefully be an interesting read. I also admit that I have absolutely no memory of this experience. I was a little over 2 years old and just starting to walk on my own when this event took place. My mom only told me this story around 3 years ago when I was 32 and about to get married. My mother was raised in a very tiny fundamentalist Christian community and had no belief in the paranormal. She believed that our souls sleep until Judgment Day or something like this. Ergo, there are no ghosts or spirits to haunt houses. Even over 30 years later, she still sounded terrified as she told me this. This woman, who always talks way too loudly, was literally whispering by the end of it, and she was white as a sheet. I believed her completely and still do. My mom never talks about stuff like this. I'm just glad I can't remember it too. In 1988, my parents had their second child. This was my brother, Victor alias. We were very crowded in our rented flat with 2 babies. My parents decided to move to a rambling old 2-story farmhouse on a 7-acre plot in southern Ohio for more room for the family. It was way out in the sticks, and it took almost an hour to get to town from there. My mom said the first time I saw the house, I freaked out. I was crying and saying things like, "Don't like mean houses. Mean house, ugly house, don't like. Scary house, mama, don't like." My mom says this behavior was very out of character for me, but I stopped complaining about the house after a few weeks, so she chalked it up to the stress of the move. Now this house was ramshackled and in the middle of nowhere. The kitchen was to the far rear of the house and, until recently before we moved in, still had a working ancient wood-burning cooking stove against the back wall. This had caught the back wall on fire a couple of months before we moved in and caused a lot of damage. A lot of this damage wasn't fixed, so my young, broke parents got a very cheap rent agreement. Gotta love the 80s. On the second floor, directly above the kitchen, was a locked room. The landlord claimed it had heavy fire damage, but her son, who had done the repairs, claimed the only fire damage left was in the kitchen since it had been the worst and was beyond his skill level to fix. Either way, the landlord was adamant that the room was off limits, and my parents always respected that. I would have looked 100%. I know all this because I heard stories about the crappy farmhouse with the creepy door my whole life, and there were pictures of us in and around the farmhouse. The locked door was right next to the upstairs landing, so there was no avoiding it, and both my parents have told me it gave them the creeps. A few months after we moved in, my mother and I were in the yard with our pit/Doberman mix, Boss. She was hanging laundry, and I was rolling around with the dog. She said that just as she noticed that everything was way too silent, Boss started going ape sh*t from surprisingly far away. About 500 yards from the house on the left, there was a small duck pond. Boss was in between the two, running towards my mom, then turning and running back towards the pond, barking frantically the whole time. My mom saw something thrashing around in the middle of the pond. She took off towards the water at full speed. Boss beat her there and dragged me out of the water himself. "Thank you, pupper, I love you." Although my mom was confused about how I got so far so fast and how I got into the center of the pond since it was over my head and I couldn't swim, she figured she underestimated me and brought in the baby gates and playpens. I was to be contained from now on. A few weeks later, she was cooking downstairs. Boss was outside. Victor was asleep in his crib, and I was in my playpen in my room upstairs. I also had a gate on my door and one at the top of the stairs. The stairs ran up from the side of the kitchen, so my mom said she could listen for us crying or fussing while cooking. My mom said no longer than 15 minutes after the last time she looked in on his kids, Boss started going crazy again in the yard. She runs up to check on us. Victor's still sleeping. Every baby gate is still shut and locked, but I am not in my room. A frenzied search reveals I'm not in the house at all. A sudden image of Boss saving me from drowning causes my mom to rush outside to see what he's trying to tell her this time. She said he was running circles in the yard, barking uncontrollably. When she got outside, he took off towards the right, away from the pond. He would run ahead, turn around, and bark at my mother, waiting for her to catch up a little before racing off again. He ended up leading her for almost a mile and a half out onto the dirt road that separated our property from our neighbors. He led her to a thick stand of trees on our neighbor's side of the rocky drive. She said what hit her first was the foul stench of advanced decay. She plowed into the trees with her heart in her throat and her stomach full of ice. She said she noticed many piles of corrugated tin, tarps, tires, and other debris. The miasma was emanating most strongly from these junkyard cairns. Peeking under a sheet of tin, she discovered the extremely decomposed corpse of a butchered cow. As she headed deeper into the thicket, where the tree cover was denser, she said less care was taken to cover the remains. Grisly pieces of bones and rotted chunks of bovine littered the area. Apparently our neighbor, in an effort to cheat his taxes, had been illegally slaughtering cattle and hiding the remains in, at least, one of the few thick stands of trees around. She found me in the dead center of this thicket, just standing there looking around like I was confused, surrounded by carnage. She said I didn't seem scared or anything. I was just standing. She rushed over to me and, after ascertaining that I wasn't injured, began questioning me on why I was here, how I got there, etc. Keep in mind that, although my mother said I started speaking very young, I still didn't have much of a vocabulary. She said I told her, with that serious look only small children can give, that the children brought me here, shotting her pants at the thought that anyone, even children, could walk right past her through the kitchen, get me from upstairs, and walk right back past her on the way down the stairs and out with me. She demanded to know what children and where the hell they are now. I looked at her dead serious and told her the ones that lived with us in the room at the top of the stairs and that I didn't see them anymore. After a moment of stunned silence, she started asking all kinds of questions about these children. However, she told me that I refused to say anything else. She said that as long as she questioned me about what happened, I would just stand there, staring at her with a serious expression and my mouth closed. She said the same pattern held true every other time she brought it up to me, so she was always left wondering and immediately began hounding my dad about moving closer to town. While the incident with me getting to the pond was highly unlikely, it was at least remotely possible. My mother is adamant that being in the hidden slaughter yard that day was simply impossible. She says there is no way I could have even known it was out there, much less have the ability to open and relock the baby gates, get downstairs, past her, and end up almost 2 miles down the road and in this place in under 15 minutes. I was only 2 and as slow and clumsy as most toddlers. As I said, she is still shaken by it after 30 years. Personally, I have no idea what happened that day. I've thought about hypnosis but haven't yet decided. I really want to remember. Maybe it's better to let it be a mystery, because whatever those things were, I really don't think they were children. The White Witch. In the early 80s, I lived in Okinawa, Japan. My dad thought that seeing the world would be an adventure that would help my brother and I become better men. And I have to say, I think he was right. Being in the military showed me cultures that many would never get to experience, and I am thankful for every experience that life gave me, even the scary ones. While we lived in Japan, my father wanted us to have a fully immersive experience, so he chose to move us into a small Japanese neighborhood off base. We lived in a little house at the top of an enormous hill in a cul-de-sac that overlooked, I kid you not, part of a huge zoo, and, on one side, a fairly large cemetery. Our particular house was set far above the monkey habitats, about a mile downhill. Between us and those habitats was nothing but a thick Indiana Jones-style jungle. The neighborhood kids, and I would tromp through endlessly, ignoring the local warnings about poisonous snakes and ancient untripped mines from World War II. We were the only American family living in that cul-de-sac, completely surrounded by Japanese families, and it was amazing. The kids loved us, and although we couldn't communicate through language very well, we understood each other perfectly most of the time. Opposite us was an older couple with a lush garden surrounding their property. The older woman wanted us to call her Mama San, and she had us help her garden whenever she could coax us over with green tea and chocolate/banana cookies. We loved her. She was so welcoming and generous. As was everyone else, actually. We lived in a wonderful neighborhood. The only drawback to Mama San's home, however, was that she directly overlooked the cemetery. And that cemetery was unlike any cemetery I had ever seen before. Because Okinawa is an island, burials don't happen very often. Instead, above-ground crypts are built. Many of them were built into the sides of the hills that make up the island. The crypts are large, made of huge arcs of polished stone set over a large square of that stone, which has a square insert cut into the middle of it for the coffin to be placed inside. Once inside, the square is inset with another piece of polished stone just inside, leaving a kind of shelf on the outside so offerings could be made to lost loved ones. Yen, food, flowers, and incense are some of the offerings given. Below Mama San's house was a valley that swooped back up into another hill opposite her home. That valley and both hills were covered with these crypts, and spider webbing up and down through the crypts were various stone step pathways that were old and badly maintained. It was quite a sight. One evening, Mama San asked me to come visit her alone. She had something to show me, but it was only for me as the older brother. Intrigued and a bit proud, I agreed. She took me to the back of her garden and sat me on a thick wooden bench that was carved with scenes of fishermen and men with swords. She told me she had a story to tell. Mama San then disappeared for a few minutes and soon returned with a tray that held hot green tea and sweet rice cakes. Sitting next to me, she smiled and commented on the colors of the evening sky as the sun began to lower. Mama San said she had seen me, my brother, and some other kids daring each other to follow a stairway path down into the cemetery. You have to understand that the path from our little home area down to the cemetery consisted of hundreds of steps, many broken or cracking, in and out of bushes, and at a steep incline. It would be dangerous for anyone, but the real test was seeing how long we could take walking through the crypts at night. Mama San wanted to explain why that was a bad idea. Many years ago, during the war, Americans were thought to be devils. Monsters that would murder innocent citizens for no reason other than to kill. That fear was the product of wartime propaganda used to encourage young men to serve in the military and farmers to fight along with them. But many didn't. Many ran. And with nowhere to go and nowhere to hide, hundreds of Japanese citizens hurled themselves off a cliffside rather than face torture at the hands of their perceived enemy. I was terrified at hearing this. I had no idea this had happened. I was mortified and hit with such sadness that I started to cry. The sun was setting, and the sky went from pink and blue to a deep orange and red. Mama-san reached out and held my hand, telling me not to worry. This was in the past, and the past is something we must always remember so we never go back. She went on with her story. One young woman had followed through with the sacrifice with her 2 children, but she survived the fall. She was in a coma for months. When she did regain consciousness, she was horrified to realize she was not with her children. They had been buried somewhere in the cemetery below, in an unmarked crypt that held many others. The woman would spend days and nights searching the cemetery, crying in pain. The torment of her loss was unbearable, until the day she threw herself into the ocean to hopefully be reunited with her lost family. But they say she never found her children. Her act of suicide doomed her to purgatory. She would remain tortured for eternity. The sun had disappeared, the cemetery drowned in inky blackness, and the main path was dotted with dim, broken lights feebly illuminating small areas. Mama-san continued. She still wanders the cemetery, she said, looking for her kids. You can hear her crying. And then she pointed down. I didn't want to, but I did. I looked. In the back of the cemetery, in the darkness, there was a white figure. At first, it had a bright, white shimmer, moving slowly, kind of shaking. It moved from side to side, like it was moving among the crypts, and you could actually hear the crying. Softly at first, but then low moans and whimpers of pain as it got closer. I was terrified. I wanted to run, but Mama-san held my hand and whispered that she wouldn't come up here. We were too far. But that is why we shouldn't go down there after dark. She said many don't know her story and call her the White Witch, which angers her. It's best to stay away. It's best to pray for her. Mama-san said she comes out to see her often, hoping one day she will find her salvation. Needless to say, I never went down to that cemetery. Not once. And I never sat back there with Mama-san again either. That was enough for me. I did, however, visit Suicide Hill. It's called Peace Prayer Park now out of respect. I cried the whole time we were there. I prayed for all the souls and for forgiveness. So many Japanese citizens spoke to us, welcoming us, telling us stories, and sharing with us. I didn't feel worthy, and my love for the country and its people was overwhelming. I'll never forget my time there. I'd like to go back, to see if she's still there, wandering the graves, looking for her children. Why I stopped telling ghost stories. This is my first time posting on Reddit, so please forgive me if I don't get the format right. To start, in my culture, we avoid saying ghosts, especially their particular names. For example, in Western culture, there's Banshee, Woman in White, Boogeyman, and stuff like that. In my culture, I'm Malaysian, we have ghosts like Pontianak, Pokong, Toyol, and Langsuer, among others. Saying their names out loud is said to summon them. I love ghost stories, but not the Western kind. I love Asian ghost stories. Perhaps because that's what I grew up with. I find them spookier than Western ghosts. Due to the language barrier, there are not a lot of Malaysian ghost stories available in English. So 6 years ago, I started a YouTube channel where I read ghost stories that are mainly from Southeast Asia. I would record my voice reading the stories at home, of course. Since I was living with another girl at the time, she also happened to be my colleague. We were working at a customer service call center that operates 24 hours a day, and our shift rotates weekly. Our 2-bedroom apartment was so small that there was barely any privacy when it came to noises. So I would usually only record when my roommate was out. I didn't want to bother her with my voice, and I would prefer not to have sounds from her going about her life in my recording. One time, my roommate was working the overnight shift. She left around 8 o'clock in the evening, and I just got home from work 2 hours prior, so I decided to record my second video. About half an hour after my roommate left for work, I started recording in my bedroom. I think it was a little bit more than halfway through the second story when I heard someone entering the apartment, which was weird since her shift should at least take about 8.5 hours. I thought that if she came home early, it would be more than likely that she was not feeling well. So I went to check on her. When I went to look for her, she was nowhere to be found. The only logical explanation was that the sound was from the next door unit, so I went back to recording. Not more than 15 minutes later, I heard the sound of a chair being pulled from under the dining table, followed by water running in our shower room just seconds later. Confident I was home alone, I went to check it. My bedroom door was facing directly toward the shower room door. As soon as I opened my bedroom door, I had a clear view of the open shower door, revealing a dark shower room. At this point, I was getting nervous. My thoughts were all over the place. I froze for a bit before I decided to look into the shower. The sound of water running can still be heard. When I flicked the shower room light switch on, the shower was running, but there was no one in there. I turned off the shower and went looking for my roommate again. Maybe I missed her the first time? But still, I found nobody in the apartment. I was a little nervous, but I was determined to continue recording. I wanted to be a YouTuber, and I hope one day I can quit my job and tell ghost stories full-time. So I did. I finished recording the stories and went straight into editing. Around 1 a.m., I needed a toilet break. As you can see in the diagram attached, the toilet is separate from the shower and can only be accessed through the kitchen. After I finished my business, while I was passing through the kitchen, I could hear a giggle from the living room. That stopped me in my tracks. I had a clear view of the well-lit living room. There was obviously no one there. At this point, I knew I was not alone. I ran into my bedroom and locked the door behind me. I hid under my covers, and that's when I heard something try to open my bedroom door. It went on for what felt like forever. I fell asleep, and for some reason, I finished editing my story and posted it a few days later. Everything quieted down for a little while, so I decided to record another story. This time I was recording during the day. It was my off day, and my housemate was out shopping or something. Everything went smoothly. So smoothly that I was able to post the video by the time my housemate came home. That night, we decided to watch a movie together. Before we started the movie, I went into the kitchen to make myself some snacks while my roommate picked a movie. Our TV is positioned on the same wall that divides the living room, my bedroom, and the sofa right across from it. So you can see the kitchen door and shower room door when sitting on the sofa. As I was coming out of the kitchen, I asked my roommate if she had found a movie. She was looking at me with a surprised look. "Didn't you just go into the shower room like 30 seconds ago?" she asked. I just shook my head and went to sit. The topic died there, and we picked a Malaysian horror comedy movie. Mid-movie, our shower room door whipped open violently, and we heard what sounded like a giggle. My roommate decided to sleep in my room that night. That was the last time we watched anything related to ghosts. Since then, I often hear furniture being moved, giggles, and shadows moving in my peripherals. But when I turn to look, there is nothing, sometimes even when my roommate is home. She also has experienced some spooky stuff in the apartment, like her back being tapped by something while she was in the kitchen, hearing my voice calling her name when I was not home, and a shadow running from the kitchen into the shower room while she was watching TV in the living room. We stayed there for a few more months until my roommate quit her job to move back to her hometown, and I decided to move in with another colleague. The new house was much larger. It was a 3-story house. I stopped recording ghost stories for a while after that. Even though I love ghost stories, I do not particularly like experiencing one. It took me about 8 or 9 months before I had the courage to record another ghost story. It was not a very good idea. I will post about that one soon. And if you're wondering, why am I sharing this story now? Apparently, even after I stopped recording ghost stories, I still encounter supernatural activity. So I might as well share it anyway. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I really appreciate all of the support. Thank you for watching, and have a good night.